In the year 1519, a small group of Spanish soldiers stood at the edge of a causeway, staring at something they could not explain. Before them, rising from the surface of a vast lake, was a city. White towers caught the morning light. Temples stood higher than anything most of these men had ever seen in Europe. Smoke curled upward from incense burners along stone pathways, and thousands of canoes moved silently through a network of canals that stretched in every direction. One of those soldiers, a man named Bernal Diaz del Castillo, would later write about this moment. He described how the men around him whispered to each other, asking whether what they were seeing was real or whether it was a dream. He compared the sight to the enchanted cities from old legends, stories of places too beautiful to exist in the real world. And yet, there it was, built not on solid ground, but on water, a city of stone rising from a lake. This was Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and by the standards of the early 16th century, it was one of the largest cities on Earth, larger than most European capitals of the time. Its markets drew tens of thousands of traders every single day. Its streets were swept clean each morning. It had aqueducts, public schools, botanical gardens, and a zoo. But there was something else. Something the Spanish soldiers noticed almost immediately. At the center of the city, towering above everything else, stood the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. A massive stone pyramid, painted in vivid red and blue, rising in steep steps toward the sky. And from the top of that temple, something dark ran down the stairs, stains that no amount of rain could wash away. Blood. Not a little, not from an accident, the kind of staining that comes from repetition, from years, decades, perhaps centuries of the same act carried out on the same stone under the same sky. The Spanish would eventually learn what happened at the top of those stairs, but to understand why it happened, to understand how an advanced civilization, one capable of building a city on a lake, could also carry out ritual killing on a scale that still divides historians, you have to go back much further than 1519. You have to go back to the moment the sun was born. The Aztecs believed that the world had been created and destroyed 4 times before. Each cycle was called a sun. The first sun ended when jaguars devoured humanity. The second sun was swept away by catastrophic winds. The third sun burned in a rain of fire. The fourth sun drowned in a great flood. Each time the gods tried to build a world that would last, and each time it fell apart. Now the world existed under the 5th sun, the current age, the final attempt. But the 5th sun had not come easily. According to the most widely known version of the myth, the gods gathered in darkness after the 4th sun had been destroyed. The world was black. There was no light. Someone had to become the new sun. But to do so, that god would have to throw himself into a massive bonfire and be consumed by the flames. 2 gods volunteered. The first was wealthy and powerful, adorned in fine feathers and turquoise. But when he approached the fire, he faltered. The heat was unbearable. He stepped back. He tried again, and again he could not do it. The second volunteer was Nanahuatzin, small, humble, covered in sores. He was not impressive. No one expected much of him. But without hesitation, Nanahuatzin walked into the flames and was consumed. He became the sun. There was just one problem.
The new sun appeared in the sky, but it did not move. It hung there, motionless, burning, but going nowhere. The world remained frozen between light and darkness. So the other gods made a decision. One by one, they sacrificed themselves, offering their own blood. And only then did the sun begin to move across the sky. Life resumed. The fifth world began. But the message of this story was not subtle. The Aztecs understood it with absolute clarity. The sun moves because of sacrifice. The sun lives because of blood. And if the blood stops flowing, the sun will stop moving. Darkness will return, and the fifth world, like the four before it, will come to an end. This was not a metaphor to the Aztecs. This was not poetry or symbolism. This was physics. The way they understood the mechanics of the universe, blood was the fuel that kept everything running. Without it, the sky would go dark, the crops would die, and an earthquake would tear the world apart. The stars and the moon waged war against the sun every single night. Every dawn was a victory, and every victory required energy, energy that could only come from one source: human blood. And so, from the very foundation of their civilization, the Aztecs built a system designed to ensure that the blood never stopped. To understand the scale of what the Aztecs built, you have to see Tenochtitlan not as a ruin or artifact, but as a living, working city. It sat in the middle of Lake Texcoco, in the Valley of Mexico, connected to the mainland by 3 enormous causeways. Fresh water flowed in through aqueducts. Waste was collected and carried out by canoe. The streets were laid in a grid, organized around canals, and the entire city was built on a combination of natural islands and chinampas, floating gardens made by layering soil and vegetation onto wooden frames anchored in the shallow lake bed. These chinampas were extraordinarily productive. They could yield multiple harvests per year, feeding the city's enormous population. At the heart of the city was the Sacred Precinct, a walled complex containing dozens of temples, schools, and ceremonial platforms. And at the center of that precinct stood the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, dedicated to 2 gods, Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture, and Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. The temple was not just a religious building, it was the axis of the Aztec universe, the point where the human world met the divine, where the energy of sacrifice was transmitted upward to keep the cosmos in balance. But the city was far more than its temple. The Great Market of Tlatelolco, Tenochtitlan's twin city, was one of the largest marketplaces in the world at the time. Spanish observers described it with open astonishment. Tens of thousands of people gathered there on major market days, buying and selling everything from woven textiles and obsidian blades to exotic feathers, medicinal herbs, and prepared food. Cacao beans served as a form of currency. There were judges stationed in the market to settle disputes on the spot. There were designated sections for different goods, arranged with a level of order that the Spanish admitted surpassed many European markets. Children attended schools. Not just the children of nobles, commoners too were educated, though in different institutions. Boys trained for warfare and civic duties. Girls learned domestic crafts, religious rituals, and healing practices. The Aztecs had a sophisticated calendar system, advanced knowledge of astronomy, a complex legal code, and a system of record-keeping through painted manuscripts called codices. This was not a primitive society. By virtually every measure of urban complexity, infrastructure, trade, education, law, agriculture, Tenochtitlan was among the most advanced cities on the planet in the early 16th century. What struck the Spanish most, perhaps even more than the architecture or the markets, was the cleanliness. Tenochtitlan had something that no European city of the era could claim: a sanitation system. Waste was collected in canoes and carried out of the city to be used as fertilizer on the Chinampas. Public latrines were stationed along major roads and canals. The streets were washed and swept every day by teams of workers, over 1,000 of them according to some Spanish accounts. In contrast, 16th century London and Paris were cities where people still emptied chamber pots from upper windows into the streets below. Madrid had no sewer system at all. The Spanish soldiers walking through Tenochtitlan were, whether they realized it or not, standing inside a city that was more hygienic than anything they had left behind. And then there was the zoo. Moctezuma maintained an enormous collection of animals: jaguars, pumas, eagles, rattlesnakes, and species the Spanish had never seen before. There were separate buildings for birds of prey, kept by dedicated handlers. There was an aviary so large and so filled with rare tropical birds that the sound of it could be heard from several blocks away. Bernal Diaz described it with clear admiration, noting the variety and the beauty of the birds, before adding, almost as an afterthought, that the carnivorous animals were fed on the bodies of sacrificed humans. That single detail captures something essential about Tenochtitlan. The beauty and the horror were not separate things. They existed in the same space, supported the same system, and were sustained by the same logic. The flowers in the market were beautiful. The children in the schools were laughing, and at the top of the great temple, a priest was opening a man's chest with an obsidian blade. These things existed at the same time, in the same city, under the same sun. And to the Aztecs, they were not contradictions. They were the reason the world still existed. The first thing to understand about Aztec human sacrifice is that it was not random violence. It was not cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It operated within a framework of belief so deeply embedded in Aztec thought that to question it would have been like questioning gravity. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Humans owed a debt, a blood debt, that could never be fully repaid, only maintained. Every sunrise was proof that the debt was being honored. Every sunset was a reminder that it could all end. And so, the Aztec state organized itself around a single imperative: the continuous supply of sacrificial offerings. This is where war enters the picture, but not war as the Spanish understood it, and not war as we understand it today. The Aztecs did not always fight to kill. In many cases, they fought to capture. A warrior's status was determined not by how many enemies he slew, but by how many he took alive. Capturing an enemy on the battlefield was one of the highest honors a man could achieve. It elevated his social rank, granted him privileges, and brought glory to his family. The practice known as the Flower Wars, Xochitl, is one of the most debated aspects of Aztec military culture. These were prearranged battles fought between the Aztec Triple Alliance and neighboring states, sometimes at set times and places. Their exact purpose is still argued by historians. Some scholars believe they were primarily fought to capture prisoners for sacrifice. Others argue they served broader political and military purposes, testing warriors, asserting dominance, and weakening rival states over time. The truth likely involves some combination of both. What is clear is that captives taken in these battles were frequently destined for the sacrificial stone.
But not all sacrifices were prisoners of war. Some were slaves, some were volunteers, or at least people chosen through systems that blurred the line between selection and consent. One of the most striking examples was the Ixchiptla, a living embodiment of a god. In certain festivals, a young man would be chosen to represent the god Tezcatlipoca. For an entire year, he would live as the god made flesh. He was dressed in the finest clothes, given 4 female companions, and honored wherever he went. People bowed to him in the streets. He played music, carried flowers, and was treated with a reverence normally reserved for the divine. And then, on the appointed day, he walked up the steps of the temple. At each step, he broke one of the flutes he had played during his year of glory. At the top, the priests were waiting. He knew what was coming. He had always known. And according to the accounts that survive, he went willingly, because within the logic of the Aztec cosmos, this was not a death, it was a transformation. He was not being killed, he was becoming the god he had spent a year embodying. But sacrifice was not only something the Aztecs did to others, it was also something the Aztecs did to themselves. Across all levels of society, from the emperor to the lowest commoner, self-sacrifice, auto-sacrifice, was a routine part of daily religious life. People pierced their earlobes, their tongues, and their shins with cactus spines or obsidian blades, drawing their own blood and offering it to the gods. This was not punishment, it was devotion. Priests performed the most extreme versions, sometimes drawing ropes of thorns through their tongues or ears, bleeding freely onto strips of bark paper that were then burned as offerings. The logic was consistent. If the gods had shed their blood to create the world, then every human owed blood in return, and the most honest form of payment was your own. Human sacrifice was the most powerful offering, but it sat at the top of a spectrum that included the blood of every person in the empire, given willingly, given often, given without question. This is what makes Aztec sacrifice so difficult to process from a modern perspective. It does not fit neatly into the categories we want to assign it. It was brutal, there is no softening that. A human chest was opened, a beating heart was pulled out, the body was sent tumbling down the pyramid steps. These are facts. But it was also deeply ritualized, carefully structured, and embedded in a worldview where the alternative, doing nothing, meant the annihilation of all life on Earth. The scale remains one of the most contested questions in Mesoamerican history. Spanish sources recorded numbers so large that modern historians still debate whether they were exaggerated. But even the most conservative scholarly estimates describe something staggering. Across the empire, in every major city, sacrifices took place during every significant festival throughout the calendar year. The Templo Mayor was not the only site. Every temple in every Aztec-controlled city participated in this system. The 1487 dedication of the expanded Templo Mayor is often cited as a peak moment. Spanish-era sources claim enormous numbers of victims were sacrificed over the course of 4 days. Modern scholars have sharply revised these figures downward, but even the reduced estimates suggest something extraordinary event. One that would have been visible, audible, and unmistakable to everyone in the city. The air would have carried the scent of copal incense and blood. The drums would not have stopped, and the lines of captives stretched down the steps and into the streets. For nearly 2 centuries, the Aztec system worked. The empire expanded. Tribute flowed in from conquered territories: gold, feathers, jade, cacao, cotton, and, most importantly, captives. The sun rose every morning, the rains came, the harvests grew. To the Aztecs, this was proof that the sacrifices were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. But the system carried a flaw, one that was invisible from the inside but obvious from the outside. Every captive who climbed the steps of the Templo Mayor came from somewhere. He had a family, he had a village, he had a people, and those people remembered. The Aztec Empire did not rule through loyalty, it ruled through fear and tribute. Conquered states were not absorbed, they were dominated. They paid their taxes, sent their captives, and seethed in silence. The Aztecs did not need to be loved, they needed to be feared. And they were. For generations, the system held. Then, in 1519, a new variable entered the equation. Hernán Cortés landed on the Gulf Coast with roughly 500 soldiers, a handful of horses, cannons, and steel weapons the Aztecs had never encountered. By any rational military assessment, this small force should not have been a threat to an empire of millions. The Aztecs had armies that numbered in the tens of thousands. They had centuries of military tradition. They controlled the most powerful state in Mesoamerica. But Cortés had something the Aztecs did not expect: allies. As the Spanish marched inland, they encountered the Tlaxcalans, a powerful people who had resisted Aztec domination for decades and had suffered repeated losses in the Flower Wars. The Tlaxcalans had no love for the Spanish, and initial encounters between the two groups were violent. But after several battles, the Tlaxcalans recognized an opportunity. They did not join Cortés because they admired him. They joined because they hated the Aztecs more. And the Tlaxcalans were not alone. As Cortés moved deeper into the Valley of Mexico, more and more subject peoples, states that had been forced to send tribute and sacrificial victims to Tenochtitlan, chose to side with the newcomers. The Aztec Empire's system of terror, which had held everything together for so long, was now pulling everything apart. When Cortés and his allies finally entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519, they were received as guests by the Emperor Moctezuma. What followed was a period of uneasy coexistence that eventually collapsed into violence. The Spanish took Moctezuma hostage. A massacre at the Great Temple during a religious festival carried out by Spanish soldiers under Pedro de Alvarado ignited a citywide uprising. The Spanish were driven out of the city in a chaotic nighttime retreat known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers died. Dozens of their indigenous allies were killed. But the worst blow was not military, it was biological. Smallpox arrived with the Spanish. The Aztecs had never been exposed to the virus. They had no immunity, no understanding of what was happening, and no way to stop it. The disease moved through the city with terrifying speed. Historians estimate that between a third and half of the population may have died during the epidemic. Warriors, priests, nobles, commoners, the disease made no distinctions. Among its victims was Cuitláhuac, Moctezuma's brother and successor, who had led the resistance against the Spanish. He ruled for just 80 days before the disease killed him. In his place rose Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, the last Aztec emperor. He was young, likely around 25, and he inherited a city under siege, ravaged by plague, cut off from supplies, and surrounded by enemies who had once been subjects. Cuauhtémoc fought. For months, the defenders of Tenochtitlan held out against the combined forces of the Spanish and their indigenous allies.
The siege was brutal. Food ran out. Fresh water was cut off when the Spanish destroyed the aqueducts. The streets that had once been swept clean every morning were now filled with rubble and bodies. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to flee across the lake by canoe. According to the Spanish accounts, when he was brought before Cortés, he pointed to the knife at the conqueror's belt and asked to be struck dead on the spot. Cortés refused. But even in defeat, the story did not end cleanly. Cortés kept Cuauhtémoc alive. The young emperor was too valuable, both as a political tool and as a potential source of information about Aztec gold. When the expected treasure of Tenochtitlan turned out to be far less than the Spanish had imagined, Cuauhtémoc was tortured. His feet were burned over hot coals in an attempt to force him to reveal the location of hidden wealth. He revealed little. He survived.
For the next 3 years, Cuauhtémoc lived as a captive, still holding the title of Tlatoani, but stripped of all real power. Then, in 1525, Cortés brought him along on a grueling expedition to Honduras, fearing that leaving him behind might inspire a rebellion. Somewhere in the jungle lowlands, Cortés accused Cuauhtémoc of plotting against him. The evidence was thin. Even Bernal Diaz, who was there, called the execution unjust. Cuauhtémoc was hanged. According to Diaz, his last words to Cortés, delivered through an interpreter, were these: "Now I understand your false promises and the kind of death you have had in store for me. May God demand justice from you." Cortés, Diaz wrote, could not sleep for days afterwards. Tenochtitlan fell. The temples were pulled down. The canals were filled in. The stones of the Great Temple were used to build churches and colonial government buildings. The lake itself would eventually be drained over the following centuries. On the ground where the Templo Mayor once stood, the Spanish built a cathedral. The Aztec capital was buried, not just conquered, but physically erased, layer by layer beneath the streets of what would become Mexico City. The fifth sun had set. For more than 400 years, Tenochtitlan existed only in texts, codices, and memory. The city was gone. The lake was gone. Mexico City grew on top of it, and with every new building, every new road, every new foundation, the Aztec capital sank deeper beneath the modern world. Then, in February 1978, electrical workers digging near the main plaza of Mexico City struck something solid. It was a carved stone disc over 3 meters wide, depicting a dismembered goddess, Coyoxauhqui, the moon, sister of Huitzilopochtli, torn apart by her brother in the myth that defined Aztec cosmic warfare. The workers had found the base of the Templo Mayor. What followed was one of the most significant archaeological excavations in the history of the Americas. Buildings were demolished to make room. Layer by layer, archaeologists uncovered the remains of the Great Temple. Not one temple, but 7 successive versions, each built on top of the last, each larger than the one before. They found offerings buried in stone boxes, obsidian blades, shells from distant oceans, jade masks, the bones of jaguars, and the remains of sacrificial victims. The temple was not a ruin. It was a record.
Each layer preserved a moment in Aztec history, a snapshot of what mattered most to the people who built it and what they were willing to do to keep their world alive. Today, the Templo Mayor site sits in the heart of Mexico City, just steps from the Metropolitan Cathedral that was built from its stones. The ancient and the colonial exist side by side, one partially unearthed, the other still standing, both claiming the same ground. And the question that visitors ask, the question that historians and archaeologists and students still debate, is not a simple one. Were the Aztecs cruel? By modern standards, of course. What happened on those temple steps was violent beyond what most people today can comfortably imagine. But that is a judgment from the outside, from a world that operates under entirely different assumptions about the universe, about death, and about what holds reality together.
The Aztecs did not sacrifice because they enjoyed suffering. They sacrificed because they believed, with total, unshakable conviction, that if they stopped, everything would end. Not just their empire, not just their city, everything. The sun, the sky, the earth beneath their feet. They were, in their own understanding, the people standing between existence and oblivion. Every heart offered was another day of sunlight. Every drop of blood was another morning. They were wrong, of course. The sun does not run on blood. The sky does not need human hearts to hold itself in place. But their world did end, not because the sacrifices stopped, but because 500 soldiers, tens of thousands of indigenous allies, and a virus no one could see brought the fifth sun crashing down in exactly the kind of catastrophe the Aztecs had always feared. They had spent centuries trying to prevent the end of the world. And in the end, the world they knew was destroyed, not by darkness falling from the sky, but by men arriving from the sea.